Blackwater Draw Locality Number 1 is a well-stratified multi-component archaeological site that yields evidence of some of the earliest human occupation in the New World. Evidence of human-made artifacts has been found here, occurring in the same sediments as the remains of extinct animals, pushing back the antiquity of human occupation in the Americas to a time when these animals last lived, the end of the Pleistocene or Ice Age. Blackwater Draw Locality Number 1 is located on the southern high plains of eastern New Mexico, about 6 miles north of Portales and 14 miles southwest of Clovis. The southern high plains, or the Llano Estacado, meaning stockade or staked plains, is a flat featureless plateau of eastern New Mexico and West Texas. The environment on the southern high plains is much different now than at the end of the Pleistocene some 12,000 years ago. Blackwater Draw Locality 1 was originally a spring-fed pond that attracted a multitude of animals known collectively as megafauna. Today there are no permanent springs or rivers on the southern high plains, and without the presence of flowing water, the decrease in the precipitation, and the drop in the water table, the southern high plains is gradually dried up. The valleys, playas, and ponds filled, bearing the bones of extinct animals and the artifacts left by humans in layers of sediments. This constant deposition has preserved a stratified continuous record of human occupation, creating a natural laboratory for research into the early occupants of the southern high plains and to produce evidence of the environment of the animals of that time. Before we can continue and discuss the history of the archaeological research at Blackwater Draw, we need to place it in the broader, scientific context of the time before its discovery. In Europe, by the mid to the late 1800s, different discoveries were made of large fossil bones in undisturbed association with stone artifacts. These discoveries led to an acceptance of an Old World, Paleolithic man, and by the 1880s in the New World, a great interest developed in establishing a similar framework for an American Paleolithic man. But certain influential elites in the scientific and the scholarly communities were opposed to this notion of an American Paleolithic and made it almost impossible for a site to gain acceptance. During this time, numerous finds were made in North America of uncertain integrity and poor documentation that resulted in dismissal of this idea of an American Paleolithic. These early discoveries and heated debates led to arguments over exactly what constituted acceptable evidence. It was recognized that age could not be determined by the similarity of stone tools. Age must be based off of carefully documented geological context. On August 27, 1908, the Geological Context needed to establish a framework for an American Paleolithic was exposed by a flash flood that hit the small northeastern town in New Mexico named Folsom. After the storm, a local ranch foreman was out checking the fence lines and discovered large fossil bones exposed from the recent rains. The foreman, George McJunkin, knew these bones were not cow bones and spread the news of his discovery. Many years after his death, the Denver Museum of Natural History learned of McJunkin's finds and started excavating at that location. In July of 1926, the excavations uncovered a finely made projectile point with a central groove, or a flute, called a Folsom Point among the bones of an extinct form of bison. By the end of the next year's excavations, there was enough proof, even for the influential elites, to realize that the first Americans had arrived at least by the end of the Pleistocene, when this now form of extinct bison once roamed the plains. 2 years after the significant excavations at Folsom, a young man from Clovis, New Mexico, named Ridgely Whiteman, discovered Blackwater Draw in 1929. Whiteman found a stylized biface, or fluted point, similar to the ones found at Folsom, along with mammoth bones in a blowout or a wind deflation basin. What Whiteman had found is known today as a diagnostic Paleo-Indian artifact commonly called a Clovis Point. What makes this artifact diagnostic is the unique style, a flute or a single flake that had been removed from the base. It was morphologically similar to the artifacts found at Folsom, but was unknown at the time of Whiteman's discovery was that a subtle, stylistic change in these unique bifaces would chronologically place these artifacts in time, making one older than the other. Even though Blackwater Draw was discovered in 1929, no scientific research was carried out until 1932, when the importance of Blackwater Draw was brought to E.B. Howard's attention. Howard was on the southern high plains looking for early man sites. On his way back home to Philadelphia, Howard visited Blackwater Draw and planned to conduct excavations the following summer. However, a few months after Howard visited the site, the New Mexico State Highway Department began excavating gravel at that location in September of 1932. The mining operation opened 2 gravel quarries, the North and South pits here at Blackwater Draw. The presence of the gravel mining operation was destructive due to the fact that the commercial gravels were located under the strata that contained the artifacts. However, it was also beneficial because it removed large quantities of overburden and exposed animal bones and artifacts. The initial gravel mining operation only lasted for a few months and was abandoned by December of 1932. For about 2 decades, the North and South pits here at the site remained unchanged and were extensively studied by paleontologists and archaeologists. The research resulted in detailed data on the nature of the strata exposed in the walls of the 2 pits and the identification of animal bones. By January of 1933, different bones from Blackwater Draw were identified as mammoth, bison antiquus, camel, and horse. At the end of the Pleistocene, a wide range of animals became extinct. These included the American mammoth, the bison antiquus, the pre-Columbian horse, camel, and many others. The demonstration of artifacts in situ, that is, in an undisturbed context with these now extinct animals, provided evidence of human occupation in the New World around the end of the Pleistocene, reinforcing the finds at Folsom. This demonstration of the association of artifacts and extinct animal bones would become the primary concern of research and excavations at Blackwater Draw until the mid-1950s. In the summer of 1933, Howard directed a project where the initial concern was to study the stratigraphy and the positioning of artifacts and vertebrate fossils. 3 years later, in 1936, detailed excavations were conducted for the recovery of artifacts and fossils in situ or in an undisturbed context. The first attempt to preserve the site took place in 1940, when John Cotter, an archaeologist who worked with Howard, sent a letter to the U.S. National Park Service representative. In his letter, Cotter argued for the importance and the need to preserve the site as an outdoor in situ museum. However, Cotter's request to preserve the site was unsuccessful. In the years to follow, the site was abandoned and no research was conducted until after World War II, when professional interest was renewed at the gravel pits by E. H. Sellards of the Texas Memorial Museum. He requested one of his colleagues to test the deposits at the gravel pit, which he termed Blackwater Draw Locality No. 1. Upon the start of the investigations at the site, artifacts were immediately found in situ with vertebrate fossils, and once again excavations began to expose the stratigraphy for detailed study. The banks of the gravel pit were cleaned off, and Glenn Evans, who at the time was employed by the Texas Memorial Museum, worked out the geological descriptions of various units, preparing maps and stratigraphic cross-sections of the deposits. This concept of stratigraphy is important to archaeologists because it represents the passage of time. The lowest, or the basal units, are the oldest, and the top, or the surface units, are the most recent. Evans' descriptions became the basic stratigraphic type section for the site, a template for the passage of time. The deepest or the basal units here at Blackwater Draw contain no artifacts and consist of the commercial gravels that were mined. The overlying stratigraphic unit contained Paleo-Indian aged artifacts and consisted of gray sand. The unit above that contained no cultural material and was described as a browned sand wedge. The next unit also contained Paleo-Indian aged artifacts and was described as a diatomaceous earth that was covered by a carbonaceous silt. The next strata contained still later aged artifacts called Archaic and consisted of jointed sand. The last and the most recent deposition at the site consisted of a tan, wind-blown sand. In the discipline of archaeology, without the presence of an absolute date, the past is usually characterized by similarities and distinct changes in artifact styles that correspond with a rough estimation of time. The distinction, Paleo-Indian, refers to the oldest inhabitants of the Americas and was defined and characterized at this time by the presence of fluted bifaces or points. The distinction, Archaic, was defined at this time by the disappearance of fluted artifacts and a noticeable change in settlement and subsistence patterns. After the Texas Memorial Museum excavations, work at Blackwater Draw was discontinued. During this time, the land that the site was on was purchased by another individual, and by May of 1952, Sam Sanders of Portales, New Mexico, acquired the lease on the mineral rights and started mining gravel once again. This was the only gravel pit operating within a radius of 75 to 100 miles, and operation soon expanded with increasing demands. Explosives were used to break up the sand and gravels, and heavy machinery was used to remove the overburden and transport the gravel. The research at Blackwater Draw at this time took a new approach. Instead of research being primarily concerned with the stratigraphy and the positioning of artifacts and extinct animal bones, research was now directed at salvaging as much data and as many specimens as possible which are exposed from the gravel mining operation. In addition, a greater control of the chronology with the advancements in technology led to the collection of charcoal for C14 dates or radiocarbon dating for absolute dates. The resumption of the gravel mining operation also prompted other institutions and archaeologists to become involved with Blackwater Draw. As a result, state and local officials were contacted in an attempt to have portions of the gravel pit set aside for a scientific preserve. By May of 1956, it was apparent that the preserve would not be set aside and the site would continue to be destroyed. This resulted in many institutions and organizations conducting salvage excavations at Blackwater Draw in an attempt to save as much information as possible. During this time, the gravel mining operation was in full swing and removed approximately 100 to 200 cubic yards of sand and gravel and equal amounts of overburden daily. For the next several years, archaeologists would work alongside the gravel mining operation, excavating in the most promising areas of the gravel pit. By 1961, the destruction of the site was nearly complete, extending to the limits of the prehistoric pond. Only in a few isolated spots was the original stratigraphy preserved. But by the next year, some of the most spectacular finds were made at Blackwater Draw along the northwest border of the gravel pit in an area being stripped to obtain the gravel deposits underneath. One major discovery was made by J.D. Murray, a dredge operator who mined gravel. He located a hot spot and recovered approximately 50 artifacts in 2 hours. As news of his discovery became known, excavations began, and 2 days later, approximately 200 artifacts were recovered. A few months later, in November of 1962, another major find was made along the north wall of the gravel pit. Immediately, excavations began, and by January of 1963, 5 mammoths were uncovered with more than 100 associated Clovis-aged artifacts. Adjacent to the mammoth bone bed was a stratigraphic wall 3.65 meters, or roughly 12 feet tall, with Folsom, late Paleo-Indian, and Archaic-aged artifacts superimposed over the bone bed. Unequivocally, these excavations supported the finds at Folsom, demonstrating the antiquity of humans in North America and the stylistic cultural sequence of Paleo-Indian bifaces at Blackwater Draw. The oldest bifaces here at Blackwater Draw are commonly called Clovis Points, and they are associated with the remains of mammoth. The Clovis Points have a flute or a single flake removed from both sides of the base, about 1/3 of its length. The Clovis Points found here at Blackwater Draw date between 11,200 to 10,900 years before present. Later in time, the style of bifaces change, and the next oldest are commonly called Folsom Points. They are smaller than the Clovis Point and generally associated with extinct bison. The flute on Folsom Points now extends 2/3 of its length, and these date between 10,500 to 10,000 years before present. Later in time, the Folsom styles give way to late Paleo-Indian styles, which some archaeologists describe as being variations of reworked types. The late Paleo-Indian artifacts here at Blackwater Draw are found in association with and above Folsom artifacts, suggesting a temporal overlap, though most of these artifacts found here at Blackwater Draw date between 9,800 to 6,200 years before present. Along with these stylized bifaces, other artifacts are found in association with them, and together they make up what is known as a Paleo-Indian toolkit. These toolkits are composed of the stylized bifaces, which are considered to be a multifunctional tool. Associated with these are unstylized bifaces that are usually made on large and small flakes or cores and are considered to be blanks or preforms. Other artifacts found in the toolkit are associated scrapers, a beveled implement usually made on flakes used for various scraping or cutting tasks. Another common implement found in the toolkit are gravers. They also are usually made on flakes and have an end protrusion for incising or engraving. The last category of stone artifacts found in the toolkit are simple utilized flake tools, both modified and unmodified. Other artifacts also occur in the toolkit, but are only found in environments where organic material is preserved and usually consist of various bone and ivory implements that are shaped and formed. The few artifacts that are thrown away, left, or lost by Paleo-Indians and later found by archaeologists give us clues to the past way of life. One such clue here at Blackwater Draw is raw material resource that were exploited for stone tool manufacturing changes between Clovis and Folsom times. In the archaeological record, it appears that during Clovis times, Paleo-Indians utilized stone resources that included alabate silicified dolomite, Edwards chert, and Tecovas chert. But during Folsom times, the archaeological record indicates primarily only Edwards chert was used for stone tool manufacturing. This change in raw material exploitation has been used by archaeologists along with the environmental and the fauna data to argue for changes in subsistence patterns. One such argument is known as Broylo's model. Broylo proposed that the environmental data suggests that during Clovis times, there was a greater amount of surface water and soil moisture. This would have created a lusher environment supporting large herbivores like the mammoth, allowing them to roam the southern high plains in search of food. During Clovis times, group mobility would have coincided with these seasonal rounds of mammoth, allowing them to encounter and exploit a greater range of raw materials for stone tool manufacturing. As for Folsom times, the environmental data suggests less surface water and soil moisture, limiting the vegetation growth to river and stream valleys. This restricted the movement of large, now extinct form of bison, thus restricting the subsistence rounds of Folsom times and limiting their access to other raw materials for stone tool manufacturing. This hypothesis is based on more than one assumption, but what should be recognized here is that a change in raw material usage probably corresponds to a change in mobility. Blackwater Draw became a National Historic Landmark in 1961, and the site was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1966. By 1979, Blackwater Draw Locality No. 1 was under the protection and direct management of Eastern New Mexico University. ENMU's long-term goals for the site have been the preservation of the archaeological deposits, to develop an active research program, and to create an interpretive program that will allow the public to visit and view the archaeological deposits in situ. The development of the interpretive program led to the stabilization and the construction of the current trails and the excavation and the stabilization of the South Bank. The South Bank excavations remained open and was originally protected with a removable canvas cover that enabled the visitors to see the in situ archaeological deposits. These excavations and earlier research here at Blackwater Draw suggested that the South Bank is a southward extension of the archaeological deposits, everything else being destroyed by gravel mining and salvage excavations. It became known by the 1980s that this southward extension is a continuation of the classical stratigraphy that follows an outlet channel or an ephemeral stream from the former prehistoric pond. It was unknown at the time how far the classical stratigraphy extended and was hypothesized that this channel would be a favorable spot to find other deeply buried sites. The research was conducted in 1983 and 1984 to effectively test the outlet channel termed spring draw. The hypothesis was tested by systematically coring the landscape to determine how far the original stratigraphy extended and to map the draw itself. It was determined that there was concentration of bison bones from each coring location up to 600 meters south of the managed portion of the former gravel pits. The bones were most likely from Folsom and late Paleo-Indian times, and this research warrants the protection of the spring draw and suggests that unprotected portions of the site likely contain significant stratified cultural materials. Throughout the rest of the 1980s, research projects under the direction of ENMU were carried out to test other sites or localities near the former prehistoric pond margins. By the 1990s, fieldwork was conducted as part of the construction process of building the office, site manager's house, well, and utility lines in the east central portion of the managed area. Some artifacts were found, but most of this area showed evidence of disturbance due to the former gravel mining operation. By 1991, excavations were carried out to relocate an unidentified pit feature that was recorded back in 1964. It was originally reported that the pit feature had tool marks on its edge, was 60 centimeters in diameter and 140 centimeters deep. The feature was photographed and backfilled, but its function was never determined. It was speculated that this feature might be a hand-dug well. The feature was rediscovered in 1993 and is now believed to be a dry hole dug by Clovis Paleo-Indians, which was an unsuccessful attempt at reaching shallow groundwater around 11,500 years ago. The significance of this feature supports the notion that the surface water that was indicated to exist by the former prehistoric pond was not a reliable source or always available during Clovis times. 3 years later, excavations were conducted for the foundation of the South Bank Building or Interpretive Center. By 1998, ENMU held their first field school inside the South Bank Building, leaving most of the cultural materials in situ for public viewing. It roughly took 50 years since John Cotter wrote a letter to the National Park Service for Blackwater Draw Locality No. 1 to be preserved as an in situ museum. In his letter, Cotter wrote, quote, "As you know, there is probably no other fossil bed in this country which yields itself so perfectly to in situ demonstration. It had always been my dream that such an exhibit could be made in situ over the exact spot, with a permanent structure erected over it." In passing, there are a few more subjects or questions that need to be addressed. For instance, where did Paleo-Indians come from? It has long been believed and first proposed by Thomas Gage in 1648 that the New World was originally populated by people who came from Northern Asia to the Americas through the Bering Straits area. This hypothesis has been re-evaluated more than once since its conception, and with the discoveries of Folsom and Blackwater Draw, it has been proposed that these people were big game hunters who followed migrating herds of megafauna to the New World. Regardless as to how the first Americans got here, Paleo-Indians were not just big game hunters. When one looks at the Paleo-Indian data from both North and South America, a different picture is revealed. Paleo-Indians are now perceived as opportunistic hunters and gatherers who procured the most available resource. Here at Blackwater Draw, there is evidence of campsites, making it appear to be more than just a kill site. In fact, we don't even know for sure if Paleo-Indians hunted mammoths. Though it is argued that the direct association of artifacts and skeletal remains here at Blackwater Draw implies that human interaction played the role in the death of at least 2 of the 5 mammoths from the 1936 excavations. We may never know the predator-prey relationship between Paleo-Indians and mammoths, but what we do know is that mammoths were exploited. Recent discoveries of Paleo-Indian sites in southern Chile and the interdisciplinary approach to reevaluate archaeological data, both old and new, is constantly changing the theories and hypotheses that archaeologists present to explain the past. If any of the subjects covered in this video strikes your attention, I encourage you to visit Blackwater Draw or stop by your local library and become an active participant in discovering the